we've got Debbie Taylor, who is with us tonight as well. And she's currently the vice president of the community. And I think she was president previously, if I'm right. She can tell me whether I'm right or wrong. Debbie was born in Dundee, where her father was a doctor and played a central part in the Dundee Jewish community. After living both in Israel and Leicester, Debbie has now moved north of Dundee. She lives in Afford. And as I say, she's the vice president of Aberdeen Synagogue and Jewish Community. And we'll hear from her now, her take on Jewish life in Aberdeenshire. Over to you, Debbie.
Well, actually, I was asked to talk about growing up in Dundee. So
well, nobody told me that. So, but that's great. It's another Jewish community that's out with the Central Belt. So
exactly.
Go for it.
So I was, yes, I'm going to focus on what it was like growing up in Dundee, what it was like being a child, growing up in a small community. And I thought about it. I've never actually been asked, what is it like growing up in a small Jewish community? And it was kind of food, shul and school that I came up with, and a bit about the community. So hopefully I'll have time to cover those 4 areas. I reckon I was able to read before I went to school, because when we went shopping, we had to read the ingredients on the sides of the packets of biscuits and whatever else we were buying to make sure that the food was kosher. And whilst I didn't come from, I came from a traditional family. The one thing that we did do was keep a kosher house. And I remember in Dundee, we had a rabbi until the mid-60s, Reverend Siegel, and I can remember him we had a kosher butcher. So we had a fairly large community, and it was certainly a bigger community than in Aberdeen. And then the butcher, he wasn't a kosher butcher, he was a butcher that supplied kosher meat. And then the butcher decided to shut down. And from then on, meat was a problem. And we used to have these amazing Sundays out to Glasgow or Sundays out to Edinburgh, when we would buy meat and bring it back to Dundee and distribute it to the various families in Dundee. So Dundee was we never had a lot of really Orthodox people, but we had a lot of traditional Jews. And like I say, food was always an issue. Growing up, I had several cousins, and there were a few other families who had children, but they were not my age. So I didn't really grow up with other Jewish children. The boys didn't mix with the girls, and the boys went to Cheder, and I didn't go to Cheder. And I always felt really miffed about that, because on a Saturday morning, the boys would always go to shul, and then after that, they would all go to football together. And then they would come back from the football and have their Cheder class. So I didn't grow up learning Hebrew, and I wasn't really brought up learning much about Judaism at home from the perspective of what you would learn at Cheder. But what I did learn was history, an awful lot of history about the Jews. There was a lot of anger in our family in relation to the Holocaust. And we had lots and lots and lots of books about the Holocaust. And from a very young age, I remember reading those books. The content of them was never hidden from me. So there was lots and lots about the Holocaust. And because there weren't any other Jewish children that I was brought up with, and I had friends, but because of where we lived in Dundee, we lived in the centre of Dundee, I didn't have any close school friends who lived close by. So I spent a lot of time with my grandmother and her sister. And my grandmother was a staunch Zionist. And she had visited Israel in the early 50s. And the family that had found their way to Israel, I had a cousin who actually visited us in the 60s in Dundee. So we had this really close relationship with Israel. And when I was 13, I actually went with my grandmother to Israel. So my Judaism was I was a Zionist from a very, very, very young age. When I was 7 years old, the teacher of my class, it was primary 3, asked me to stand up in front of the class and tell them about being Jewish. So I have been an ambassador for Judaism since I was the age of 7. I don't remember what I actually said at the time, but it's something that has stuck with me since I was 7, because what that teacher did was single me out from everybody else. And the message was that I was different. And the teacher came from a Church of Scotland background. But her background, she wasn't one of these, she was doing it because of her love of the Jewish people. And that was why she singled me out. So from the age of 7, all my classmates knew that I was Jewish. And I remember the first time I came across anti-Semitism was in primary 5, when we used to sit round tables at school, 6 of us round a table. And I asked one of the girls next to me if I could borrow her pencil rubber. And she turned round to me and she said, "No, you're a Hui Jew. You're not getting my pencil rubber." And I've no idea to this day what on earth a Hui Jew is. When I went home, the discussion was, well, that's what's being talked about in their home, because no child of that age would know what a Hui Jew was. So it must have been coming from their parents. So that was kind of like, that was school. Community-wise, we had a very close community. Like I said, I spent a lot of time with my grandmother and her sister, and they were matriarchs in the true sense of the word. They ran the family and they had the power. And I remember there were there were quite a lot of other very strong Jewish women within the Dundee Jewish community. And what they said kind of went. Whilst they weren't sitting on the committee of the shul, it was definitely their opinions that were being put on the table when it came to discussing various matters. My grandfather, once Rabbi Siegel went, we had nobody to take services, and Dad took services for a while. But my grandfather came to live with us in 1965. My grandmother was a Fogel from Fogel's Bakery in Glasgow, and she died when she was really young. And the decision was that my grandfather would come and live with us. Now, my grandfather had trained in yeshiva in Gateshead. So he said that he would take services in the synagogue, because it became a bit too much for Dad to do it on his own, because he was a GP and he would do a surgery on Friday and then he would come rushing into the house and then he would go rushing out again because he had to take a service in shul. So life was made a lot easier when my grandfather took services, and he took services for many, many, many years in Dundee. And he only he actually started to dement in the 80s, and that was then when he stopped taking services. But by that time, the Dundee community was really beginning to disperse, and we'd had the kick in the teeth over Nablus. And Dundee was beginning to be seen as not such a great place to live if you were Jewish. And ultimately, Dad and Mum went on Aliyah. So I have in a way quite good memories of living in Dundee when I was growing up, but it wasn't all rosy. At times it was difficult, and food, as I say, food is a common theme, and getting kosher food is a common theme. I can remember times when we'd get food delivered by bus from Glasgow, or food delivered by train from Glasgow, and the stuff would arrive and be so stinking that it had to get thrown into the tay. Just crazy. And yet we continued. Mum continued to keep a kosher house. I think that's kind of it. I think in terms of growing up in Dundee.
Thank you for that insight.